Hello, my name is Jim Toot, and I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Central Virginia Community College. In this video, we'll discuss foreign and national security policies, Part 3, Major U.S. Foreign and National Security Policies between 1789 and 2001. Two visions have competed for how the United States should orient itself towards world politics. They are isolationism and internationalism. Isolationism, the policy of trying to stay aloof from foreign entanglements, has long roots in American foreign policy back to George Washington's farewell address, which warned Americans to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. During the period between World War I and World War II, the United States pursued a largely isolationist foreign policy. It refused to join the League of Nations, and Congress passed a series of bills in the 1930s that imposed a policy of neutrality on the United States in foreign conflicts. Isolationism ended with the U.S. involvement in World War II. It may regain some favor now as Americans react negatively to the financial and human cost of involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Media stories about outsourcing in which American companies give the jobs of their American employees to low-paid workers overseas may add to the isolationist impulse. Meanwhile, internationalism reigns. Internationalism means involvement in events beyond one's border to accomplish and protect the national interest. It has dominated American foreign policy since 1955, a decade after World War II ended. Internationalists favored democratization, free trade, and a policy of global military activism designed to maintain America's dominant position in world affairs. But specific policies have varied depending on the administration in power. We discuss the most important of these policies: containment, deterrence, détente and arms control, and the use of military force by the United States, particularly in Vietnam and Iraq. Containment. The World War II alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union soon gave way to a series of international crises that divided the victors into two opposing blocs. The result was a Cold War of the United States and its allies against the Soviet Union and other communist countries. The concept guiding American foreign policy in this global struggle with the Soviet Union and its allies was containment. It held that the United States did not need to engage in a war to defeat the Soviet Union. Instead, it could adopt a policy of constant vigilance and the creation of alliances in which American power would be used to contain and counter Soviet aggressive moves. During the Cold War, the news media focused on the conflict between the United States and communist countries. The main stories were the communist takeover of China, the Korean War, U.S. relations with Cuba, and the Vietnam War. Thus, until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the U.S. media depicted the world in general and the preceding stories in particular from the American side of the Cold War frame. Deterrence. Another concept guiding U.S. foreign and military policy during the Cold War was deterrence. According to deterrence theory, nuclear weapons were too powerful and destructive to be used as instruments of warfare. They were best suited to holding an opponent in check by threatening it with destruction should it engage in an act of nuclear aggression. Deterrence strategies are designed to prevent an opponent from undertaking an objectionable course of action. It was an article of faith during the Cold War that nuclear deterrence could not be assumed to exist through the possession of a large nuclear arsenal. The United States adopted a second strike strategy to deter attack by possessing the capability to absorb an enemy's nuclear attack and retaliate with so much force that it can inflict an unacceptable level of damage on its society. Stability was assumed to be assured when both sides adopted such a strategy. This created a situation of mutual assured destruction. Thus, a major concern of policymakers in the United States was that the Soviet Union not be allowed to gain a significant advantage over the United States in the size of its nuclear arsenal. Because Soviet leaders shared the same goal, the result was an arms race. As the Cold War expanded in the late 1950s and early 1960s, containment entered the Third World. Already the United States had helped bring down anti-American governments in Guatemala and Indonesia. Now, newly independent states in Africa and Asia became political and military battlegrounds in which the United States and Soviet Union supported competing local leaders. The most enduring and significant extension of containment to the Third World came in Vietnam. The Geneva Peace Accords envisioned a country temporarily divided at the 17th parallel with communist forces in control of North Vietnam and pro-Western forces in control of South Vietnam. But North Vietnam and its communist allies in South Vietnam began a military campaign to unify all of Vietnam. When President Dwight Eisenhower left office, the United States had 1,000 military advisors in Vietnam. President John F. Kennedy authorized an additional 15,000 advisors. Under President Lyndon Johnson, the war became increasingly Americanized as U.S. forces carried out sustained and massive bombing campaigns against the North, and U.S. ground troops began fighting in the South. A turning point in the war came in late January 1968. Seeking a final decisive victory, the Communists launched a massive simultaneous attack known as the Tet Offensive on major cities throughout the country. In the attack on Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, soldiers temporarily invaded the American embassy grounds in full view of American reporters and television news crews. From a purely military standpoint, Tet was a disaster. Nearly two-thirds of the Communist troops were killed or captured. The expected popular uprising against the Americans and South Vietnamese government did not take place. Yet by the end of the Tet Offensive, significant segments of the media and thus the American public had turned against the administration's conduct of the war, if not the war itself. In February 1968, the Wall Street Journal warned readers in an editorial that the effort in Vietnam may be doomed. Following a visit to Vietnam, CBS Evening News anchor Walter Cronkite famously declared that it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as honorable people who lived up to their pledges to defend democracy and did the best they could. And a special report on NBC television declared the war a failure. By late March, approval of President Johnson's handling of the situation in Vietnam had dropped to 26%, and disapproval swelled to 63%. On March 31, 1968, the president announced that he would not be running for re-election and that the U.S. bombing of North Vietnam would be restricted. After he took office in 1969, President Richard Nixon pursued a policy of Vietnamization. It was designed to create conditions so that by 1972, the South Vietnamese army would be able to hold its own when supported by U.S. air and sea power. Congress held hearings and cut off some funds. There were demonstrations against the war, especially on college campuses. Nixon's strategy failed. In the spring of 1972, North Vietnam attacked South Vietnam, forcing Nixon to re-Americanize the war. By the time the war finally ended, 55,000 U.S. troops had lost their lives in Vietnam. As many as 541,000 Americans were fighting there at the war's height, and $150 billion was spent on the war effort. Détente and arms control. President Nixon redirected American foreign and national security policy. He sought to minimize future Soviet challenges by treating the Soviet Union less as a rival and more as a partner in the international system. Known as détente, the goal was to create a framework of limited cooperation between the two superpowers within the context of ongoing competition and conflict. Détente's greatest success was in the area of arms control, most notably with the signing of the SALT I and SALT II agreements, which placed outer limits on the size of American and Soviet nuclear forces. These agreements slowed the arms race while maintaining the fundamental symmetry in the United States and Soviet nuclear forces around which deterrence had been built decades before. President Jimmy Carter's foreign policy emphasis on human rights pushed U.S.-Soviet competition into the background. He criticized the human rights abuses of leaders who had loyally stood by the United States in its containment of the Soviet Union. One of those criticized was the Shah of Iran. Put into power through a coup engineered by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1953, the Shah had been one of America's staunchest Cold War allies. But by the 1970s, he had become increasingly isolated within his own country. In January 1979, a revolution ousted the Shah, who was replaced as leader in Iran by the exiled Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. When news broke in October that the Shah was coming to the United States for medical treatment, Iranian militants seized the U.S. Embassy and held 52 Americans hostage. The Carter administration placed economic sanctions on Iran and undertook a failed hostage rescue mission in 1980. The hostages were not released until January 20, 1981, 30 minutes after Ronald Reagan became president. The media reported the crisis night after night under such titles as America Held Hostage. Only a few diplomats were being held hostage, not the entire nation. Nonetheless, the media depiction conveying the impression of American impotence probably precipitated the rescue mission and contributed to making Jimmy Carter a one-term president. President Reagan rejected the notion that the United States could cooperate or work with the Soviet Union. Under Reagan, détente and arms control ceased guiding American foreign policy. The death blow to détente had come during the Carter administration when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 in order to prop up pro-Russian communist political forces. Within a year, the Soviet Union occupation army grew to 110,000, and it had to bear the primary responsibility for fighting the guerrillas, or mujahideen, who were supported by U.S. funds. American military aid to the mujahideen rose from $120 million in 1984 to $630 million in 1987. Support for the mujahideen was consistent with the Reagan doctrine that the purpose of American foreign policy not only was to contain the spread of communism, but also was to assist in bringing down communist rulers. Most controversial was the administration's support for anti-communist forces in Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas had overthrown 40 years of arbitrary, oppressive, and corrupt family rule in July 1979. The Sandinistas were sympathetic to Cuba's Castro and hostile to the United States. In November 1981, Reagan authorized spending $19 million to transform a small and largely ineffective fighting force into one that would be more capable of ousting the Sandinista regime. They were known as the Contras. In response, Congress passed the Boland Amendments, which barred the use of CIA or Defense Department funds for the purpose of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government or provoking a military exchange between it and Honduras. Chafing under this restriction, the Reagan administration devised a covert plan for increasing the amount of funds available to the Contras. At the heart of the administration's plan was a scheme to divert money to the Contras from the covert sale of weapons to Iran. When it became public, the Iran-Contra affair produced widespread and mainly critical negative media coverage and a storm of controversy. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The end of the Cold War brought forward expressions of hope that Americans' involvement in the world might be lessened. For some, this meant that a return to isolationism was possible. For others, it meant that the United States would be able to engage in building democracy and promoting peaceful change. These alternative visions of America's role in the world were soon challenged by the reemergence of traditional national security concerns. The event that sparked this challenge was Iraq's August 2, 1990 invasion of Kuwait. It led to the Persian Gulf War, the first major international conflict of the post-Cold War era. The UN Security Council set January 15, 1991 as the deadline for Iraq's peaceful exit from Kuwait, and authorized member states to use all means necessary to bring about Iraq's complete and unconditional withdrawal. When Iraq did not withdraw, the United States launched Operation Desert Storm. On February 28, after little more than 1 month of fighting, Iraq announced a ceasefire. On April 6th, Iraq accepted the UN's terms to formally end the war. The war was a diplomatic and military success for the United States, which put together a global coalition against Iraq and conducted a military campaign that produced relatively few American casualties. Before the war, media coverage generally reflected the views of U.S. policymakers and the military. It generated little debate over policy alternatives. The war itself was overwhelmingly reported from the perspectives of U.S. policymakers and the military. In summary, two visions of foreign policy are isolationism and, dominant since World War II, internationalism. The main policies during the Cold War were containment, deterrence, détente, and arms control, and the use of military force as in Vietnam.